Joining the conversation is Busisiwe Mavuso, the Chief Executive Officer at Business Leadership South Africa. Welcome to the Democracy Gauge, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Bonga.
Define leadership for me.
You know, leadership for me is simply about just having three things, Bongan. It is about having a compelling vision, it is about having integrity, and it is about having courage. If you don't possess any of those three, then you shouldn't be calling yourself a leader. So you have to have a view in terms of what the end goal and the long goal should be. You should actually have, integrity and be able to act, beyond reproach. And of course, you should have courage. If there's decisions that you're not going to be able to make as a leader, then you don't actually fit the category of being a leader.
So you have to have a plan, you have to have the personality and the integrity to put that plan in the best interest of the people that you lead, and then you have to be strong enough to do it.
Absolutely.
So those are things that we could say make a good leader. What makes a bad leader?
If you don't have that, you don't qualify to be a leader, right? So I think leadership that doesn't have, and I think maybe leadership is about public good. Let's get that first and foremost. It is not about self, but it's about ensuring that the decisions that you make are actually going to benefit those that you're leading. Because remember, a big characterization of leadership is about followership. If you don't have followership, then you are not a leader.
Sure,
right?
But you can be a charismatic person. You can be somebody who can inspire lots of people to follow you, but not necessarily for the public good.
Absolutely. So, and I think that is the issue, that if it's not for the public good, then you're probably not acting in the best interest of the people, and therefore, you don't have integrity. So if you don't have integrity, then you don't qualify to be a leader.
We're going to look at leadership from various aspects here, but let's start with the political. I mean, I don't need to tell you what the last 2 weeks have been like in South Africa.
Absolutely.
And yet, for many people observing what's happened, both in the country and outside, they would say it took a really long time for the leadership in this country to make clear what was happening and what they're going to do about it.
Absolutely. And that is absolutely true. You see, leadership is also about leading from the front, first and foremost, right? And I think where we find ourselves as a country, from a political perspective, we need political leadership that is going to be decisive. We need political leadership that is going to be courageous. We need the political leadership that is actually going to make the decisions that ought to be made, the tough decisions. Because you see, the business of government, which is political leadership, is precisely about making the tough decisions. It is not about being collaborative all the time, because if you are going to try and seek consensus, and I think the key thing for me, Bongane, is about understanding where you are, at that time. It is about context.
Reading
it is about
the moment.
Right? It is about being a leader of your time, right? It is about working with this toolbox and understanding which tool do I need to pull from my toolbox given what opportunity. So it can't be a one-size-fits-all, and I think that is what I see, happening from a political perspective.
Explain to me how we moved, say, last week to women protesters in Cape Town at the World Economic Forum meeting that was happening there, being dealt with water cannons, to the same protesters the very next day being addressed by the president of the country. What's going on there? It seems we're not sure, we're flat-footed, we're not sure how to deal with situations like that protest.
And I think for me, the first thing would have been, how did you even get there in the first place? How did we even find ourselves where so many women actually had found it fit to actually come to West Africa to actually say, we are going to disrupt this event because there are things that should be happening in this country that are not happening. And the big issue for me that those women were demonstrating about, it is about consequence management. You see, there is something to be said about discipline in a country. There is something to be said about providing leadership, and discipline and leadership seem like such exaggerated concepts until they are no longer there. So South Africa currently lacks discipline, and this political leadership is just failing to instill that discipline. So people found it necessary to say, we're actually going to, have to make this big demonstration for us to be listened to, and it cannot be.
So you're all about business, you're all about leadership. How did all those scenes play out to international visitors? How did all those scenes play out to the very investors we need to get this economy to provide for all its people?
It actually, a big part of the conversations we had at WEF Africa, for instance, was precisely about that, right? A big part of it about condemning what was happening in the country. But someone said something very interesting. Someone said, you know, Africa is what it is because its leadership is not what it should be. He said, Africa is actually suffering from leadership deficit at the moment. If we were in charge, you know, as a continent, if we were in charge as a country, then this wouldn't be happening. But something very interesting as well, someone said, if you allow the two economies, one nation, you know, to perpetuate to the extent that it has perpetuated, then, you know, things like this are bound to manifest themselves in this shape and form.
And therefore that tells me it's easy enough to blame the politicians, but where else is leadership lacking at the moment?
You know, I think from a business perspective, we have not done enough as well, Bongani. If we had, then I think the trust deficit that currently exists between business and labor, business and government, and business and civil society wouldn't be. You know, the lack of transformation within organizations wouldn't be if business had actually, so for the longest time, the business of business had just been business, and it cannot be, because we operate in this same environment, so we've got an obligation, you know, to ensure, you know, that we therefore provide leadership from a socio-economic perspective as well. Let's agree that business has got the disproportionate resources and therefore the disproportionate voice and disproportionate power, so they've got the ability to can move this economy along towards a particular direction. But for the longest time, business has just taken a back step. But you see, this is where political leadership also comes in. Through macroeconomic policy, Bongani, you force business to do certain things. You force the country to go in a particular direction so that all can benefit. But for the longest time, business has been left to its own devices. When it comes to transformation, it has been left to the goodwill of business to happen. And that is why it hasn't happened. And that is why people are so angry at the moment.
Okay, we're going to try and unpack all of that in terms of what you mean. We'll continue the conversation. Stay with us, because after the break, we're also going to be gauging your views on whether you think we have a leadership crisis in our country. Stay tuned. Welcome back. It's all about you here on the Democracy Gate. So the People's View allows you to interact with us to tell us what you have to say. Here's our best video so far.
Revolutionary greetings to all the South Africans. South Africans, actually, we don't have a leadership crisis in the country. The only crisis that we have entrisms. So for us to deal with these entrisms, I think the South African Communist Party should take charge of running the country. Thank you, South Africans.
Well, that's certainly one view. We'll continue the conversation with Busisiwe Mavuso, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Business Leadership South Africa. I mean, you just heard that video there, and although it would be easy to dismiss it and maybe even mock it, but the essence of it comes from exactly what you were saying about the unsustainability of our economic fundamentals.
Absolutely.
Our economy cannot continue to work only for the few.
It cannot be. And I think in a country where you have more than 50% of your citizens that are living in abject poverty, Bongani, it's not sustainable. You know, if we want to grow this economy, if we want this economy to flourish, the model that we should be building towards is that of having a strong middle class, like 80% middle class. So this, you know, have and have-nots, you know, the disparities and the gap, you know, between the haves and have-nots is just too huge, you know, for this economy to be sustainable. And I think it cannot be.
Here's the thing, we often talk about this economy as though somebody else was in charge. Every time there's a criticism about how our structure operates, it's as if we've just awakened to this fact, as if we didn't know. So ultimately, if 25 years into our democracy, this is where we find ourselves, whose failure is that?
So it is a function of two things. It is a function of political failure and a function of business failure. So as I said earlier on, it is the business of government to ensure that the macroeconomic policies that we have in this country move this economy towards a particular direction. But for whatever reason, they left it to the goodwill of business to actually do the right things. You see,
but business can turn around and say, but with all the corruption that we have seen, with all the statements that are anti-business, why on earth should they get involved? What stake do they have in this project when they are the ones who are often vilified?
You see, business is not doing anyone a favor when it does the right things. it is manifestly within our interest as business to ensure that the society within which we operate is a prosperous society. Because think about it, Bongani, if we operate in a society that is not prosperous, then where are our markets supposed to come from? If you operate in a society where more than 50% of the population, lives in abject poverty, then they don't have disposable income. If they don't have disposable income, they can't walk into a shop to buy goods and services. If they can't walk into a shop, then you can't supply. If you can't supply, then demand. You know what I'm saying? So it's just a vicious circle.
But here's what happens.
Business needs to ensure that this happens.
But as you and I both know, when the pawpaw hits the fan, the rich just leave. And that's what many of them have been doing and are doing now.
And I think that is precisely what is happening. So I think the past 10 years also have been a huge setback for the country, right? And I think estimates are saying that we've lost about 500 billion in the past, 10 years, and about 2.5 million jobs, is the opportunity cost of what could have been created. And I actually look at that 10 years and I said it was not government only. Business was also complicit in this.
Here's the thing. You've got these, sides divided, digging in, fighting in the trenches, fighting each other, talking past each other, shouting at each other. Surely, at some point, we must all come together. The trade unions have a role to play. Civil society has a role to play.
We all have a role to play, but you see, this needs to be a coordinated effort. Someone needs to take leadership to say that what are you going to do as business? What are you going to do as labor? What are you going to do as civil society? And what is it that I'm going to do as government? And I actually see that being the role of government. So business has to ensure that more people are brought into the economic mainstream. And the way to do that, in my view, in this climate, Bongani, is through SMMEs. We need to open up our value chains as business, for black SMMEs, so that we can ensure that we start changing the economic trajectory in this country. Labor cannot be sitting where it's sitting, where the economy of this country has not reached 2% for the past 7 years, and they demand 11% increases. That cannot be. They too have a role to play. They can't actually be saying, business, you're not doing enough, government, you're not doing enough. What is their role going to be? Civil society also have to take ownership. I'm worried about what the political leadership has created in this country. It is a crisis of dependency and therefore a nation of beggars. That is actually going to, no one owes civil society anything. We just owe them opportunities, and that's it. And I think that actually is going to have to come out strongly.
When we fought against apartheid, everyone got involved. Yes. Community leadership was crucial. Yes. Churches were crucial. Yes. Everybody. What can we do now? We are at a point of crisis. What do we do now?
Bongani, then we had unity of purpose, but for whatever the reason is, we don't have that anymore. And I thought that this that we're facing as a country, this economic quagmire, being at the precipice, of a cliff, or being at the edge of a precipice, nearing the economic collapse, I thought that would have, drive us towards a singularity of purpose. But instead, when Finance Minister Tito Mboweni comes out with a plan to move this economy forward, then we're talking about process, right? To say that the right process wasn't followed. So it therefore begs the question for me to say that, do we even have the problem statement clearly defined? Do we understand that the window of opportunity for 57 million South Africans is actually closing? Do we understand that South Africa is not the only gateway to Africa, and there's Kenya and other gateways, and we therefore need to shape up?
And not only are there other gateways to the rest of the continent, we ourselves are having difficulty getting in now because we've allowed other people to tell our story, even in terms of what's happened in recent days. What does all of this mean for South Africa's standing, forget the world stage, but just on the continent?
We are not beyond salvaging. That is my view. We don't need to have the IMF walk in and dictate or take over our economic sovereignty, because that is actually what is going to happen. Because we are not there yet. We can still salvage this thing. But you see, Bongani, you need leadership. I'm beginning more and more to think that you need somewhat an authoritarian leadership, some kind of dictatorship, some kind of saying, this is what is going to be done.
Suspend democratic rights?
Not totally suspended, but you see, someone is going to have to provide leadership. Bongan, if you want to change things, you are not going to please everyone. And if you are pleasing everyone, you are not making enough progress. This government has got a responsibility to act in the best interest of 57 million South Africans, right? They are going to have to say, draw a line in the sand and say, what are the 2-3 things that we're actually going to have to implement to ensure that this happens? Irrespective of whether COSATU or civil society or business agrees, they have to show leadership and give direction. We can't live in this environment of uncertainty. We can't live in this state of paralysis. It just cannot be. Bongani, I'll rather have a leader that is strong and wrong rather than a leader that is weak and right. We need strong leadership. We need someone to lead the way.
We've had leaders that have been strong and wrong. We've had leadership that has been weak and right. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. What is your take on this? You can tweet us. Remember the hashtags. After the break, we'll, of course, give you the results of the poll, but we'll also meet Desiree Goodman, who's lived in a toxic industrialized part of Durban all her life. We'll hear her story coming up after the break.